After tasting a dish made by the new chef, the millionaire was reminded of the flavor his grandmother used to prepare. Robert Sterling descended the grand staircase of his mansion, his fingers absently adjusting the cuff of his sleeve, then his wristwatch. His movements were deliberate, though his mind wandered far from the material things surrounding him, things that for the longest time had defined his life. Art collections, private jets, rare wines, and designer everything. He had built an empire, lived among the elite, and indulged in luxuries that others only dreamed of. But in the quiet hours when the noise of success faded, a strange hollowness crept in, a void that grew with every passing day. And so, Robert found himself obsessed with the idea of hiring someone capable of delivering a rare experience, a chef who could surprise him. Not just with gourmet dishes, any high-end chef could do that, but with something more. Something meaningful. After months of interviews, auditions, and tasting sessions, he finally hired Isabel Thompson. There was something about her reputation, something about the way people described her food as more than flavor, that intrigued him. They said her dishes weren't just meals, they were memories on a plate. Now, seated at the head of a long, elegant dining table, Robert waited, his hands folded in front of him. Isabel was in the kitchen, preparing her first meal for him. He felt strangely tense, a feeling that irritated him. He wasn't used to waiting, especially not with this kind of anticipation. Yet here he was, leaning slightly forward in his chair, listening for the faintest clink of plates from the kitchen. When Isabel finally appeared, she moved with quiet confidence, carrying a simple dish in her hands. There were no grand flourishes, no extravagant presentation. She placed the plate in front of Robert without fanfare. It was chicken braised in wine, resting atop a bed of roasted vegetables, glistening with a light herb sauce. A dish that, by all accounts, was modest compared to the gourmet standards Robert was accustomed to. Yet something about it instantly commanded his attention. "Enjoy," Isabel said softly, stepping back to give him space. Robert picked up his fork, cut a piece of the chicken, and brought it to his lips. The first bite was like opening a door to a forgotten world. His mind spun. The flavors weren't just good, they were familiar. But not in the way one remembers a recipe from a restaurant or cookbook. No, this was personal. The wine sauce was fragrant with thyme and bay leaf, releasing an aroma so specific that Robert felt his chest tighten. It was as if time rewound itself in an instant, transporting him to a small kitchen he hadn't thought about in years. He was suddenly 8 years old again, sitting at a wooden table in his grandmother Eleanor's house. She moved around the kitchen with ease, the scent of cooking wine and fresh herbs filling the room. "Come sit, Bobby," she would say, sliding a plate in front of him. The same dish. The same aroma. She would ruffle his hair and smile, the corners of her eyes crinkling with warmth. And just like that, the memories rushed in, her laugh, the way she sang to herself while cooking, the feeling of being safe and loved. The flash of memory hit Robert so hard that he set his fork down, almost as if the food had burned him. He leaned back in his chair, stunned, his gaze distant as if looking through the walls into a different time entirely. Isabel remained quiet, her sharp eyes studying his reaction without intruding. She knew when her food stirred something deeper than hunger. It wasn't the first time she had seen this happen. "Where did you learn this recipe?" Robert asked finally, his voice low, almost reverent. Isabel tilted her head slightly, sensing the emotion behind the question. "It was one of my grandmother's specialties. Clara Johnson. She made it for special occasions." At the mention of the name, Robert's eyes sharpened. Clara Johnson. He repeated the name slowly, as if trying to place it in the puzzle that had suddenly formed in his mind. His brow furrowed, deep in thought. "My grandmother, Eleanor Sterling, had a best friend named Clara Johnson. They were inseparable." Isabel's expression softened with surprise. "Eleanor Sterling," she echoed, her voice filled with recognition. "My grandmother talked about Eleanor all the time. She said they used to cook together, experimenting with new recipes." Robert's lips curved into a rare, nostalgic smile. "Eleanor was a genius in the kitchen," he murmured, almost to himself. Isabel nodded. "That's what Clara said. She admired Eleanor deeply. From what I've heard, they weren't just friends, they were practically family." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. It was as if the past had resurfaced between them, drawing a connection neither of them had expected. Robert leaned back slightly in his chair, still absorbing the strange turn of events. It felt surreal that their grandmothers, two women bound by friendship and a shared love of cooking, had left behind threads that were now weaving Robert and Isabel's lives together. The silence was heavy with meaning, and Robert could feel it settling over them like a delicate web. This wasn't just a coincidence. It was something more. Something important. A sudden idea began to take shape in his mind. At first, it felt almost absurd, but the more he thought about it, the more it seemed right. It wasn't just about the food or the memories. This was about legacy. About honoring the past while building something new. What if, Robert began slowly, as if testing the words aloud. What if we opened a restaurant together? Isabel blinked, taken aback. A restaurant. Not just any restaurant, Robert clarified, his voice growing more certain as the idea solidified. A place that honors the memories of our grandmothers. A place where every dish tells a story, where the food isn't just about taste, but about connection. He paused, meeting Isabel's gaze directly. We could call it flavors of the past. For a moment, Isabel didn't respond. She studied him, trying to gauge the sincerity behind the proposal. Robert Sterling, the millionaire known for his cold demeanor and perfectionism, was opening up to her in a way that seemed almost impossible. This wasn't just business for him. It was personal. You're serious about this? Isabel asked cautiously, still processing the weight of what he was suggesting. Robert leaned forward, his hands resting on the edge of the table. I've never been more serious about anything. His eyes held hers with unwavering intensity. This is something I need to do. And I think, it's something you need too. Isabel's breath caught in her throat. There was something in his words that resonated deeply with her. A shared longing, for connection, for meaning, for something beyond the superficiality of success. A small genuine smile tugged at the corners of her lips. Okay, she whispered, the word carrying more weight than she expected. Robert's expression softened, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something stir inside him, something that felt a lot like hope. In that quiet moment, between shared glances and unspoken understanding, a dream was born. The launch of Flavors of the Past was nothing short of spectacular. The dining room was packed from the very first night, with reservations flooding in weeks in advance. The buzz surrounding the restaurant grew rapidly, fueled by word of mouth and glowing reviews. Patrons marveled at the way each dish seemed to evoke a forgotten memory, triggering nostalgia for childhood meals and family moments they didn't even know they still carried within them. What set Flavors of the Past apart wasn't just the food, it was the experience. Robert and Isabel had succeeded in creating more than a restaurant. It was a place where diners weren't just fed, they were transported, each bite a story, each dish a tribute to the past. Plates adorned with their grandmother's recipes arrived at tables, accompanied by small cards explaining the history behind them. The guests read about Eleanor's signature herb sauce, Clara's love for braised meats, and the deep friendship between the two women that had inspired it all. But with success came enemies. The restaurant's rapid rise in popularity did not go unnoticed, and one person in particular took their triumph personally, Vincent Marlowe. Vincent was once a rising star in the culinary world. In his prime, people called him brilliant. But somewhere along the way, whether due to arrogance, impatience, or simply bad luck, his career had derailed. He had opened a restaurant that closed within a year, humiliated by the critics who once praised him. From that moment, Vincent stopped cooking and became a food critic instead. But each review he wrote, especially the scathing ones, was a reminder of the dreams he'd failed to achieve. When Vincent saw the acclaim Flavors of the Past was receiving, it ignited a bitter flame inside him. Robert Sterling, a man with no culinary background, and Isabel Thompson, a mere chef for hire, had accomplished what Vincent never could. And worse, they were receiving admiration for something he could no longer offer: authenticity. Vincent's frustration turned into envy, and envy curdled into something darker, an obsession with tearing down what Robert and Isabel had built. It started with the reviews. Vincent published an article questioning whether Flavors of the Past deserved the hype. The dishes, he wrote, are nostalgic, sure, but nostalgic for what? The taste of mediocrity. He hinted that the restaurant relied on expensive ingredients to mask poorly executed techniques, stirring just enough doubt to make people wonder. Isabel was the first to notice the shift. The once bustling dining room began to have a few empty tables here and there. Customers asked more questions about the origins of the ingredients, some even making pointed remarks about overpriced nostalgia. Still, Robert brushed off the review. He knew the nature of the business. Critics always lurked, eager to pounce on success. But things escalated. and the attacks moved beyond words. Late one evening, after the restaurant had closed, Isabel was in the kitchen, preparing for the following day. The hum of the refrigerator and the faint clatter of her knife were the only sounds in the room. She pulled out the crate of vegetables that had been delivered that morning, and immediately stopped. The tomatoes were soft and shriveled. The zucchini was slimy. She touched a head of lettuce and recoiled. It was already rotting. Her chest tightened. That's impossible, she thought. The ingredients had arrived just hours earlier, fresh from their usual supplier. Her heart raced as she moved to the walk-in cooler. The lamb they had planned to braise tomorrow evening smelled rancid. Isabel's stomach churned as she pulled back the packaging to confirm her worst fear. The meat was spoiled. All of it. And it hadn't been when it was delivered. Someone had tampered with the ingredients. She wiped her hands on her apron and exhaled slowly, trying to contain her frustration. "Robert, we need to talk." Robert looked up from the ledger he was studying in his office. Isabel stood in the doorway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her expression was grim. She shut the door behind her, and Robert knew immediately that this was serious. "What's wrong?" he asked, sitting up straighter. Isabel walked to the edge of the desk, her jaw tight. "Someone's sabotaging us," she said bluntly. Robert frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean someone tampered with our ingredients. The vegetables are rotten, and the meat," she shook her head, her voice sharpening with anger. "It's spoiled. This isn't a mistake from the supplier. It was deliberate." Robert's eyes narrowed as he processed her words. He stood and began pacing, his hands clasped behind his back. "You think it's Marlowe," he said, more statement than question. "I know it is." Isabel's voice was steady, but her anger was palpable. "He's the only one with enough reason to do this, and enough access. You know he still has friends in the industry. It wouldn't take much for him to bribe a delivery driver or switch out an order." Robert clenched his jaw. He had dealt with competitors before, people who resented his wealth, his status, his success. But this was different. This wasn't just a business threat. It was personal. The restaurant wasn't just a venture to him, it was his way of preserving the memory of Eleanor, of giving meaning to the parts of his life he had thought were lost forever. And now someone was trying to destroy it. "We can't let him get away with this," Isabel said, her voice low but resolute. Robert turned to face her, his expression hardening. "He won't." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the situation settled between them, unspoken but understood. They weren't just defending a restaurant. They were defending something far more precious, the legacy of the two women whose stories had brought them together. Robert exhaled sharply and rubbed the back of his neck. "We'll have to change suppliers," he said, thinking aloud. "Increase security. Monitor everything that comes in and out of the kitchen." "That's a start," Isabel agreed. "But it won't stop him." "Not entirely." Robert nodded grimly. "No," he said. "But it'll buy us time." That night, long after Isabel had left the office, Robert sat alone at his desk, deep in thought. His fingers drummed absently on the surface as he stared at the paperwork in front of him without really seeing it. He knew that Marlowe's attacks wouldn't stop here. The man was vindictive, and he wouldn't rest until flavors of the past was ruined. Robert felt a knot tighten in his chest, a familiar knot he hadn't felt in years. It was the feeling of helplessness, the same feeling he'd had as a child when he'd watched his parents leave him behind at Eleanor's house, year after year, too busy with their own lives to notice how lonely he was. But Eleanor had been there for him. She had been his anchor. And now, with her gone, this restaurant was his way of holding on to that anchor. He wouldn't let Marlowe take that away from him. Not without a fight. With a determined breath, Robert picked up his phone and dialed a number. "Lucas Graham," came the voice on the other end, a private investigator Robert had hired in the past for sensitive matters. "I need your help," Robert said without hesitation. "There's someone I need you to keep an eye on." And just like that, the quiet tension in the air shifted. The battle for flavors of the past had begun. Emily Carter wasn't the kind of journalist who waited for stories to fall into her lap. She hunted them. When she first heard whispers about Vincent Marlowe's vendetta against flavors of the past, it piqued her curiosity. The rivalry between a once-celebrated chef-turned-bitter critic and one of the city's most talked-about new restaurants had all the makings of a front-page story. But this wasn't just about gossip or intrigue for Emily, it was an opportunity. She was young, ambitious, and eager to make a name for herself in a field where reputation was everything. Breaking a story this big would do more than elevate her career. It would prove to the industry that she had what it took to uncover truths hidden beneath charming facades and public personas. From the start, Emily knew that exposing Vincent's involvement wouldn't be easy. He was too clever to leave obvious evidence behind. His reputation as a manipulative, sharp-tongued critic preceded him, and Emily suspected that his ego was too large to confess anything outright, at least not without a little coaxing. She needed to get close to him, closer than a journalist typically dared. So she crafted a plan. To uncover the truth, she would have to infiltrate his circle and earn his trust. Emily's opportunity came sooner than expected. Vincent Marlowe was hosting a small, exclusive dinner for a handful of industry insiders. She managed to secure an invitation by leveraging an acquaintance from a local food magazine, introducing herself as an independent journalist researching trends in the fine dining scene. On the night of the event, she arrived early, blending effortlessly into the room filled with critics, sommeliers, and disgruntled chefs, all circling around Vincent like moths to a flame. She wore her best disarming smile, keeping her demeanor light, curious, and unassuming. She was careful not to ask too many questions too soon. With men like Vincent, the trick was to let them talk first, and keep them talking. Vincent sat at the head of the table, holding court like a king in exile. He wore his bitterness like a badge of honor, lacing his conversation with hints of condescension toward anyone who dared find success where he had failed. Emily waited patiently, sipping her wine and laughing at his cutting remarks until the moment was right. When the conversation drifted toward flavors of the past, she leaned forward slightly, her tone casual but laced with intrigue. "I've heard Sterling's restaurant is quite the sensation," she said, swirling her glass thoughtfully. "But you've seen through it, haven't you?" Vincent's eyes sharpened. For a moment, Emily thought she had overplayed her hand. But then his lips curled into a smug, knowing smile. "You could say that," Vincent replied, setting down his glass with deliberate slowness. His gaze lingered on Emily, assessing her, as if trying to decide how much to reveal. People are so easily fooled by nostalgia. They mistake memories for quality. Emily leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough to seem conspiratorial. "Is it really as shallow as all that?" she asked. "I mean, there must be more to it. It can't just be luck, can it?" Vincent chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Luck? Please. They're not as clever as they think. I know exactly what's going on behind those kitchen doors." Emily raised her eyebrows in mock curiosity. "Do you?" Vincent tilted his head, a glint of cruelty in his eyes. "Oh yes. I know all their little tricks. Substituting top-tier ingredients with subpar ones. Inflating prices to maintain their image. They think they've built something meaningful, but it's all smoke and mirrors." He smirked. "And I know exactly how to expose them." Emily fought the urge to smile. There it was, the arrogance she had been waiting for. Men like Vincent couldn't resist the temptation to boast. She had him right where she wanted. "Sounds like you've got them figured out," she said, her voice light, almost playful. "You must have inside information." Vincent's smile widened. "Let's just say I've made sure they'll regret ever opening that place." Emily's pulse quickened. She could feel the pieces falling into place. The way Vincent spoke, vague but unmistakably confident, told her he was more involved than he was letting on. But she needed more than his ego-fueled admissions. She needed hard evidence. Later that night, as the dinner guests began to filter out, Emily slipped into the hallway to make a discreet phone call. She needed backup, someone who could help her gather the kind of proof that would hold up under scrutiny. She dialed Lucas Graham, a private investigator with a reputation for solving difficult cases. Emily had worked with Lucas once before, and she trusted him to be thorough. He picked up after the second ring. "Emily Carter," Lucas greeted in his usual calm, no-nonsense tone. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I need your help," Emily said, glancing around to make sure no one could overhear. "It's about Vincent Marlowe. He's been sabotaging flavors of the past, I'm sure of it. But I need proof." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "What kind of proof are we talking about?" Lucas asked. "Anything that ties him directly to the sabotage. Emails, phone records, surveillance footage, whatever you can find." Emily lowered her voice. "He's already started spreading rumors, and now I think he's messing with their suppliers. I need to know how he's doing it." Lucas let out a low whistle. Sounds like you've got yourself a real snake. You have no idea, Emily muttered. All right, Lucas said. I'll start digging. But if Marlowe's as slippery as you say, this won't be easy. He's probably covered his tracks. I figured as much, Emily replied. But if anyone can find a loose thread, it's you. Lucas chuckled softly. Flattery will get you everywhere, Carter. Emily allowed herself a small smile. Just get me what I need, Graham. Over the next few days, Emily and Lucas coordinated their efforts. Lucas focused on tracking down Marlowe's communications, while Emily stayed close to Vincent, continuing to gather information from within his circle. It was a delicate balancing act, getting close enough to uncover the truth without tipping her hand. Meanwhile, Lucas's investigation began to yield results. He found suspicious patterns in Vincent's communications with several food suppliers, late-night emails, unexplained payments, and encrypted messages. It was clear that Vincent wasn't just spreading rumors. He was orchestrating a campaign to destroy flavors of the past from the inside out. Emily knew they were getting closer to the truth, but they needed one final piece of evidence to tie everything together. One evening, over drinks, Vincent let slip that he had arranged another shipment, one that would ensure Sterling and his little chef wouldn't see their next dinner service coming. That was all Emily needed. She excused herself from the conversation, heart pounding, and stepped outside to call Lucas. We've got him, she said, her voice low but urgent. He's planning something big, probably another sabotage. We need to move fast. I'll be ready, Lucas replied. I'll meet you at the restaurant tomorrow night. If Marlowe makes a move, we'll catch him in the act. Emily ended the call and took a deep breath. The pieces were finally falling into place. All that was left was to confront Vincent and make sure he faced the consequences of his actions. With the plan set in motion, Emily felt a flicker of anticipation. The next step would be the most dangerous, confronting a man as ruthless as Vincent Marlowe. But she wasn't backing down. Not now. She had come too far. And with Lucas by her side, she knew they had a chance to finally expose the truth. While Robert and Isabel fought to keep flavors of the past afloat under the weight of Vincent Marlowe's sabotage, Robert's sister, Grace Sterling, was forced to confront a threat far more intimate and dangerous. Nathaniel Brooks, her ex-husband. Nathaniel had reappeared after years of silence, slithering back into her life just as the restaurant's success made headlines. For Grace, his return felt like the reopening of an old wound she'd spent years trying to heal. The last time she had seen him, she was a different person, fragile, dependent, and desperate to escape the emotional prison he'd built around her. But since then, she had fought to reclaim herself, working tirelessly in therapy and rebuilding her identity from the ground up. Yet Nathaniel's presence now threatened to unravel everything she had worked so hard to protect. It began with a knock at her apartment door. Grace wasn't expecting anyone, and the moment she saw Nathaniel standing in the hallway, every muscle in her body tensed. His smile was familiar, too familiar, and just as toxic as she remembered. "Hello, Grace," he said smoothly, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Long time no see." She stared at him, her breath caught in her throat. For a moment she was paralyzed, the memories rushing back like a flood, the endless nights of manipulation, the constant fear, the way he would twist her love into control. But then something shifted inside her. She wasn't that woman anymore. "What do you want, Nathaniel?" she asked, her voice cold and steady. His smile widened, as if amused by her attempt at composure. "Straight to the point, I see. I always liked that about you." Grace tightened her grip on the door. "If you don't tell me why you're here, I'll call the police." Nathaniel chuckled, the sound low and condescending. "Come on now, Grace. We both know you don't want to do that." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Not with everything I know about your family." Her heart raced, but she refused to let him see her fear. "You don't know anything." "Oh, but I do." Nathaniel's grin was predatory. "I know about your brother's little restaurant. I know about all that money Robert's throwing into it. And I know what would happen if certain truths were made public." Grace's stomach turned. She knew exactly what he was hinting at. Nathaniel had always been good at finding cracks in people's lives and exploiting them. He would threaten to drag her family through the mud, whether there was anything true to expose or not, just to get what he wanted. "What do you want?" she asked again, though this time her voice wavered. Nathaniel leaned back, satisfied that he had her attention. "It's simple, really. I want my share of the success." Robert's doing well for himself, and you, he let the sentence hang in the air, the implication clear. You owe me, Grace. She stared at him, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest, the old panic, the sensation of being trapped. But something inside her pushed back. This time, she wouldn't crumble. This time, she would face him. You don't get to come back into my life and demand anything, she said, her voice sharpening. You're not owed a damn thing. Nathaniel's smile faltered for the first time. Grace. No, she interrupted, taking a step forward. You have no power over me. Not anymore. The words felt like a key turning in a long-locked door. For years, Nathaniel had been the shadow haunting every decision she made, the voice in the back of her mind that told her she wasn't strong enough, smart enough, or capable of standing on her own. But now, standing face to face with him, she realized something. He was smaller than she remembered. He wasn't the monster she had built up in her mind. He was just a man, a weak, desperate man clinging to the past because he had nothing left. Nathaniel's expression shifted, irritation flickering across his face. You think you're better than me now, he sneered. You think you've moved on? I have moved on, Grace replied, her voice unwavering. And there's nothing you can do to change that. For a moment, Nathaniel stood there, stunned. He had expected the old Grace, the one who would flinch under his gaze, who would bend to his threats without hesitation. But that woman was gone. He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. You're making a mistake, Grace. You'll regret this. She crossed her arms, her gaze steady. I think the only mistake I ever made was letting you into my life in the first place. Nathaniel's jaw clenched, the muscles tightening under his skin. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came. For the first time, he seemed to realize that he had lost, not just this argument, but whatever hold he thought he still had over her. Get out, Grace said quietly, but with absolute finality. He hesitated for a beat too long, as if hoping she might change her mind. When she didn't, he exhaled sharply and turned on his heel, walking away without another word. Grace stood in the doorway, watching him until he disappeared down the hall. She waited until she heard the elevator doors close before letting out a long, shaky breath. Her hands trembled slightly, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins, but she didn't feel scared. She felt free. Closing the door behind her, Grace leaned against it, her heart still racing but lighter somehow. She had confronted the ghost that had haunted her for years, and it hadn't defeated her. Nathaniel was gone, and with him went the weight she had carried for so long. She walked to the living room, sinking into the couch with a sense of relief she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just that Nathaniel was out of her life again, it was that she knew with certainty that he could never hurt her the way he once had. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Robert. How are you holding up? Need anything? Grace smiled softly, typing back, I'm good. Really? As she hit send, she knew the words were true. For the first time in a long time, she felt good, truly, deeply good. The fear that had followed her for so long was finally gone. Her thoughts drifted to Robert and the challenges he was facing at the restaurant. She knew how much flavors of the past meant to him, not just as a business venture, but as a way to honor their grandmother's legacy. He had his own battles to fight, and now, she was ready to stand by his side. Whatever came next, Grace knew she was strong enough to face it. And with that, she rose from the couch, feeling lighter than she had in years. Nathaniel Brooks was nothing more than a memory now, one that no longer held power over her. It was time to move forward. And she was finally ready. As Grace prepared to leave her apartment, she knew the hardest chapter of her life was behind her. But for Robert and Isabel, the fight was far from over. Somewhere out there, Vincent Marlowe was still scheming, and the final confrontation was drawing near. And Grace intended to be there when it happened. Emily Carter and Lucas Graham worked tirelessly over the following days, piecing together the evidence against Vincent Marlowe. Lucas uncovered the damning trail, encrypted messages to suppliers, payments under fake names, and audio recordings that captured Vincent's bragging about tampering with deliveries. Every thread unraveled the full scope of his sabotage, revealing not only his bitterness but the calculated malice behind his actions. Finally, the moment had arrived. It was time to confront him, and there was no better place to do it than the heart of everything he tried to destroy, the kitchen of flavors of the past. Vincent stood in the center of the kitchen, arms folded, looking smug. He had been summoned under the pretense of a private discussion with Robert about the restaurant's future. But as Lucas and Emily stepped through the back entrance, blocking his way out, the arrogance on Vincent's face faltered. "This is a private meeting," Vincent said, his voice sharp. He glanced toward the door as if calculating an escape route. Lucas stepped closer, his presence deliberate and unyielding. "It's over, Vincent. We have everything we need to take you down." Vincent's smirk wavered, but he kept his tone light, as if dismissing them. "I have no idea what you're talking about." Emily crossed her arms, eyes locked on him. "No more games, Vincent. We know about the emails to the suppliers, the tampered deliveries, the fake reviews." She took out her phone and tapped the screen, playing a recording of his voice. "They think they're untouchable, but one bad shipment at the right time? That's all it takes to ruin them." Vincent's face darkened. For a brief moment, panic flashed in his eyes, but he quickly masked it with indignation. "That proves nothing," he spat. "You'll never get anyone to believe your little conspiracy theory." Lucas pulled out a folder, flipping it open to reveal invoices and bank transfers tied to a fake company Vincent had set up to funnel payments. "We've got more than enough to make sure everyone believes it. The suppliers already confirmed you paid them to deliver spoiled products." He took a step closer, his voice low and dangerous. "You crossed the line, Vincent." Vincent's mask of arrogance shattered. His eyes darted toward the kitchen exit. He lunged, shoving past Emily, desperate to escape. But Lucas was faster. In a swift move, he grabbed Vincent's arm and twisted it behind his back, forcing him down onto the stainless steel counter. "Not so fast," Lucas muttered, pinning him in place. "Let me go." Vincent snarled, struggling under Lucas's grip. "You should have thought about that before you started sabotaging people's lives," Emily said coldly, watching as Lucas restrained him. Vincent thrashed, but it was useless. The weight of his actions, and the consequences, were finally crashing down on him. While the chaos played out in the kitchen, the dining room of flavors of the past was alive with warmth and joy. The restaurant was full, every table occupied by guests who had come not just for a meal but for an experience, one filled with stories, memories, and emotions that transcended food. At the center of it all stood Robert Sterling and Isabel Thompson, working in perfect harmony. They moved through the dining room with ease, exchanging smiles with guests and taking a moment to observe the impact their vision had created. Every dish that left the kitchen wasn't just food, it was a story, a tribute to the women who had shaped their lives. Robert paused by one table, taking in the hum of conversation, the laughter, the clink of glasses. It was a moment he had dreamed of but never thought possible. For so long, success had felt hollow, like something measured only by numbers and accolades. But tonight, surrounded by the people who mattered most, he felt something far more profound, a sense of belonging, of peace. At the far end of the room, Grace Sterling sat with a quiet smile on her face. She looked different tonight, lighter, as if a weight she had carried for years had finally been lifted. For the first time in a long time, she felt free. Nathaniel Brooks was a ghost of the past, and she was done letting him haunt her. She raised her glass toward Robert, who caught her eye from across the room. He nodded, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. They had both fought their battles, and won. Emily Carter and Lucas Graham stood near the bar, observing the lively room. Emily glanced up at Lucas, her expression softening. "You make a pretty good partner," she said, nudging him lightly with her shoulder. Lucas smirked. "Likewise. I guess we make a decent team." Emily's lips curled into a smile. "Maybe we should do this more often." Lucas arched an eyebrow. "You mean take down corrupt food critics?" "Something like that." Emily laughed, a genuine sound that hinted at the friendship, maybe more, that had grown between them over the course of the investigation. Lucas tilted his glass toward her. "To truth, justice, and good food." Emily clinked her glass against his, their gazes lingering for just a second longer than necessary. As the evening wore on, Robert and Isabel found a quiet moment near the kitchen entrance, away from the bustling crowd. "We did it," Robert murmured, glancing out at the room filled with satisfied guests. Isabel smiled softly. "We really did." There was a pause, filled with the weight of everything they had been through. The sabotage, the rumors, the doubts, it was all behind them now. And what remained was something far more enduring. "This place," Robert said quietly, his voice tinged with emotion, "it's not just about the food, is it?" Isabel shook her head. "No. It never was. Robert looked at her, gratitude and admiration shining in his eyes. Thank you, Isabel. For everything. She met his gaze, her smile warm and sincere. Thank you, Robert. I think Eleanor and Clara would be proud of us. Robert's throat tightened at the mention of their grandmothers, but for the first time, the memory didn't feel heavy. It felt like a gift, a connection that would carry on through every meal they served. Here's to them, Robert whispered. To them, Isabel echoed, raising an imaginary glass. The night ended with a standing ovation from the guests, who left the restaurant with full hearts and promises to return. As the last table cleared and the lights dimmed, Robert, Isabel, Grace, Emily, and Lucas gathered together in the dining room for a quiet moment of reflection. Feels like we're finally home, Grace said softly, glancing around the room. Robert nodded. Yeah, it does. Flavors of the Past wasn't just a restaurant. It was a place where memories lived, where stories were shared, and where people found connection, through food, through family, and through the ties that time could never break. Vincent Marlowe would face the consequences of his actions, but that wasn't the story Robert and Isabel cared about anymore. What mattered was what they had built, and what it meant to everyone who walked through their doors. They had fought for this place. And they had won. As the team stood together, surrounded by the echoes of the evening's joy, Robert looked around the room one last time and smiled. They weren't just serving meals. They were serving moments, and that was something no one could ever take away.
If you've made it this far, then subscribe to the channel and leave a comment.